Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
Welcome to Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Now, today is the last day of Phase 2 of the MCO, and already Defence Minister Ismail Sabri Yaakob has warned that police are going to be stricter with MCO enforcement during Phase 3. Now, it seemed that the number of people in violation of the MCO had been increasing every day. As of yesterday, over 9,000 individuals have been arrested. So starting tomorrow, the police will be focusing less on issuing compound notices, but instead will now remand flouters to be brought straight to court. Now, I'm sure this was meant to be a stern warning, but my concern is, Sharaad, that there's going to be unintended consequences of crowding at police stations and magistrate offices. I mean, will social distancing be able to be observed? And if it won't be, wouldn't that defeat the purpose of the MCO in the first place?
Indeed, there are a lot of interesting questions that come out of this. Now, we've all noted, and people have said this over and over again, the extraordinary moment for the nation, as it is for much of the world, really. The question is, we're now trying to criminalize things that people in their own minds think as very ordinary behavior. Going to the shop, going for a walk, going to the park. So to get them to kind of understand that why it is that this is now a huge problem and that they should take this much more seriously. Yes, one way is punishment. I think the fines are there.
Thousand ringgit fines,
I think
right?
that's far too much. And I honestly, Melisa, I think that the quantum, first of all, has to be commensurate with the crime. The second part of it is that you don't necessarily change behavior in that way. And if, like you point out, the unintended consequences that we had before of fines that were so high that people ended up going to prisons. Now, prisons are the worst place to put people for who've gone out to shop or gone out and violated,
Agreed.
the MCO. But
yes.
But that seems to be the consequence. Is there a middle path?
Well,
I don't know.
I definitely think that, we should be trying to understand the root causes of MCO violations. According to Ismail Sabri, he said, now many are using excuses like buying groceries, buying food, going to the bank, or buying provisions for their elderly parents, and the police will not easily accept these excuses anymore. I'm wondering whether these are not considered valid reasons to be out.
Yeah, the question, of course, is, and we've had, some notable cases of somebody who went to buy groceries 4 times in a day. Now, because if the police can track everybody and determine whether they're lying about when they last went,
right?
How would you maintain this? I mean,
exactly.
Is there going to be a truth test taken at every roadblock? I do think, Melisa, that at the end of the day, perhaps there needs to be more public education. Our politicians have been woeful in demonstrating good behavior. They're still doing public engagement, still doing the big check ceremonies, traveling. Our politicians
interstate travel. Yes, that's
Indeed.
right.
So, well, if they set bad examples, why should the rest of the population, in their minds, follow the rules?
Right. So apart from cracking down on people during the MCO, how do we get the buy-in of the public? Indonesia has an interesting way. A village in Indonesia has deployed a cast of ghosts or pocong to patrol the streets in hopes that superstition will keep people indoors. But it's had the opposite effect. Unfortunately, instead of keeping people in, it's brought people out because they want to have a sighting, a ghost sighting, so to speak. So
well, they want to be
backfired.
But Melisa, again, I think it's a question of the kind of population you're dealing with, and you have to kind of disaggregate. You can't use one strategy for all kinds of people. Certainly not this country. Can you kind of treat everybody as sort of easily scared by ghouls and stuff?
Or by fines, or by a crackdown by police. How do we get the buy-in of the public exactly?
And of course, as people crave to return to normalcy, you will see increasing attempts to game the system. I think that's going to be part of the course. I don't know if bigger fines are really going to do it if people want to travel. Now, we also had recently just reported that Malaysian Airlines is going to be opening up the routes between the peninsula and East Malaysia. And I think that's significant because the Director General of Health is coming to say they'll do screening. And by screening, they mean they will be taking people's temperature before they board.
Right. So if you have a fever, the Director General is saying, do not travel. But the problem is whether those asymptomatic might pass through the
net.
Well,
that's precisely the problem. It does not address the whole issue that is part of this this phenomena of the asymptomatic carrier. Now, but nevertheless, people will need to go back. People who have been stuck in the peninsula need to go back to Sabah, Sarawak, and vice versa. And I'm sure they're relieved to know that they can finally get back to their homes.
All right, moving on in other news, Health Director General Datuk Nur Hisham Abdullah today revealed that Malaysia only has 19 days supply of PPE items left. This is personal protective equipment used by medical frontliners. Now, the Director General provided a breakdown today in his briefing of when various PPE items could run out. So, for instance, we only have 19 days worth of protective overalls. We have only 25 days supply of disposable face shields and 37 days of N95 masks. Now, frontliners have also been asked to follow PPE guidelines to avoid wastage. So only those who truly need to wear PPE should do so. I mean, that's terrible to think that frontliners have to ration their use of PPE, isn't it, Sharaad?
Yeah, Melissa, because this goes back to what this pandemic is exposing in terms of the way that we work and the way that we trade, the way goods are produced globally.
Right.
And if you read at any point in the day when you pick up some news item about how other countries are dealing with this, we'll discover major countries like India that produce drugs often have to get their active ingredients in their drugs from other countries. China, for instance, supplies some 60% of the active ingredients of some of the drugs that India produces. So how do you stop things? What do you do with the national borders?
Right.
And of course, there are advocates in Malaysia saying that we need a Pandemic Production Act, and that's something they call, I mean, loosely using that expression.
Well, similar to that of the US. The US had invoked the Defense Production Act, where the federal government can dictate what equipment is produced and where it goes. Now, I'm really glad that the DG had brought this up, because he's highlighting a problem that something that could become a problem down the road. But there is still time. So perhaps if the government acts today, by perhaps mobilizing Malaysia's production lines, by getting the workforce to help create more PPE for our medical frontliners, we could avoid this problem.
But because, Melissa, one of the big problems, and that's been pointed out by an economist and a public health expert that wrote a piece about this, was that we don't have the legislation, the enabling legislation. Now, without convening Parliament, because we know that's a big political hot potato, without convening Parliament, we can't have that enabling legislation. Donald Trump has enabling legislation. Malaysia, the Malaysian government does not have that. How are they going to have that? They're going to have to convene Parliament.
That's right.
The experts say.
Well, there's still time, so let's hope that our leaders act. Now, today, ASEAN leaders had a virtual summit to discuss collective and coordinated action against the COVID-19 pandemic. So in just a few minutes, we're going to be speaking to experts from around the region to discuss more about this new transnational challenge. So stay tuned to consider this. If you've just joined us, you're watching Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, with me, Sharaad Kuttan. Now, earlier today, 10 leaders of ASEAN countries had a video conference to discuss the bloc's coordinated action against the COVID-19 pandemic. How will ASEAN collectively deal with this new transnational challenge? Joining us on the line now is Her Excellency Yuyun Wahyuningrum, representative of Indonesia to the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights. Good evening, Yuyun. Thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Thank you.
Today's virtual meeting was chaired by Vietnam, and in his opening remarks, the Vietnamese Prime Minister had hailed ASEAN's work to fight the virus so far. Yuyun, do you agree that ASEAN's response so far has been worthy of praise?
Well, I saw a number of changing of approaches For instance, in the previous declaration, ASEAN talked about the whole of government approach. Now it's shifted into whole of ASEAN community approach. So there is a change of paradigm. ASEAN has been criticized by a lot of international community and also by civil society that these approaches toward COVID-19 has been rather country approach, not necessarily regional approach, not necessarily community approach. So actually, I welcome the approach by the ASEAN today, saying that this is this issue require the whole of ASEAN community approaches, which means ASEAN social-cultural, ASEAN political security, and ASEAN economic community should be able to contribute to what they call it as control the spread. So I think this is the two ways, as we read in the declaration, the way ASEAN is dealing with the virus is through two ways. First, to control the spread, maybe because in the absence of vaccine. And secondly, by mitigating the adverse impact to people's livelihood. So mitigation does not need to wait until the COVID-19 finished, but we can do it now. I think that's something that we need to applaud. We need something that we need to welcome.
Yuyun, if I could interrupt you at this point in time. Sorry, Yuyun, if I could just interrupt. The declaration notes that there are several already existing institutions. It talks about future fund and such, but it does have certain institutions, they say, already are activated. The ASEAN Center of Military Medicine, the network of ASEAN chemical, biological, radiological defense experts. Many Malaysians, never mind ASEAN members, might have never heard of these institutions. Do they actually work?
Well, actually, before this one, we rarely know that ASEAN has done a lot of things. Like, for instance, not only in the document, in the previous discussion, ASEAN also come up with ASEAN Emergency Operations Center Network, risk assessment of international dissemination of COVID-19 in ASEAN region. We do not know about this. So I think there is a problem in communicating what ASEAN has done. So people are not informed about what ASEAN has been doing so far in addressing the COVID-19. I hope after this, all sectoral bodies, not only the Ministry of Health, be able to respond quickly, more effectively, and transparency. Right. So this is something that's also very rare in the ASEAN document, that the word transparent mentioned twice. So I think they really emphasize the need to be transparent, not only by the ASEAN member states, but also by the ASEAN as a regional organization, to be able to be transparent among each other, to be able to help each other.
Okay.
This is another approach.
Can I come back to that point, Yuyun, that you made, about the whole of ASEAN community approach? I've read too the criticisms that's been levied to the ASEAN response of COVID-19 being described as somewhat a nation-first mentality. Mm-hmm. I'm just wondering, in times of crises, shouldn't governments put their nations first? Why is a community, an ASEAN bloc community mentality, one that should be put forth?
Well, I think because with this issue, the first group that will be affected with this virus is actually individual. Individual are responsibility of the state. So the state should be the first to respond to the issue, not ASEAN. ASEAN is a regional organization of the state. So ASEAN will take some of the roles, like, for instance, working together to come up with a vaccine, working together to use these warehouses in different countries to be able to...
Oh, we seem to have lost you.
And working on laboratory cooperation, for instance. So the first thing, the first person or the first group to respond to this issue is actually the government, not ASEAN. So the government, and then after that, ASEAN be able to help government to deal with the issue.
Right. You know, Yuyun, one of the things that the declaration also mentions is the need to perhaps cooperate in terms of medical resources, protective, gear, and so on. So issues that are now of global concern. Do you think ASEAN will have the mechanisms to actually create stockpiles, to distribute them in a way that makes sense in terms of the various and differing needs and capacities of member states? Is there a level of sophistication in ASEAN to actually do that?
Well, as of now, I'm not sure, to be honest, but we have the AHA Center that has been very effective in distributing logistics in natural disaster situation. So perhaps this is, well, the AHA Center also mentioned in the declaration, and other institutions, like you mentioned earlier, the bringing the military network of the ASEAN. So these are the mechanism, the existing mechanism and network that can be used by ASEAN. So dealing with pandemic is new, not only for ASEAN, for the whole world. So we need to test. We need to see whether or not this quick response of ASEAN mechanism can be used. So let's see how it works. But something I would like to mention here, that the declaration does not mention about human rights. Our COVID-19 challenge the enjoyment of human rights. Human rights discourses not necessarily appear in this document, which I, coming from the AICHR, the Asean Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, is quite disappointed.
Right.
But but to my knowledge, I appreciate that the word marginalized group, not marginalized, vulnerable group, stigmatization and discrimination are mentioned there, which I really appreciate that. Wow. But marginalized group are not mentioned, such as migrant workers, refugees, and so that's actually question the idea of public health. Because public health is about public, about everyone.
Very important point there, Yuyun. Thank you so much for bringing that up. Definitely that human rights does not appear in this declaration. In fact, we're going to continue this conversation even more. Thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. We're going to take a quick break and come back and take a look at more on ASEAN's response to COVID-19. Stay tuned to consider this. Thanks for staying with Sharaad and I on Consider This. Let's continue our conversation about ASEAN's response to COVID-19 following the emergency virtual summit held earlier today. Now joining us on the line, we have Joel Mark Baysa-Borredo, Program Manager for SHAPE-C, which is the Strengthening Human Rights and Peace Research and Education in Southeast Asia program. Joel, good evening. Thank you for coming on the show tonight. Now,
thank you so much.
SHAPE-C had organized a webinar with Forum Asia yesterday regarding the status of human rights in Southeast Asia during the time of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, one of the observations shared was that many ASEAN governments are treating the pandemic as a security issue rather than a health and medical issue. Now, can you tell us the implications of this approach?
Definitely, I think the securitization of COVID-19, first and foremost, that the use of the military approach into solving the issue is something that is worrisome. It definitely, from a human rights perspective, does affect the way that people are able to access services and able to enjoy their freedoms in this time of crisis. It becomes a precedent, especially in these times and with political regimes that we have at the moment, that can definitely affect the way that human rights are being protected, especially if they're marginalized.
Joel, could you help us understand if this is a kind of across-the-board situation for the region, or does it actually vary in terms of country, in terms of their own either democratic institutions or lack of democratic institutions?
I think it's becoming a trend all throughout the region. It's very much telling of how governments have dealt with their societies, even pre-COVID. This is as well, I think, the restriction of movement. It's always, I see it as always a reaction to the pandemic. And this is very much a question of how the government views public health. Because if there is an emphasis towards public health, an inclusive public health system, then we don't need to resort to military means of dealing with the situation.
Joel, can I just ask you, to what extent do you think various national publics, different constituent groups actually think that it's okay, that they were happy to suspend some fundamental liberties, and primarily that of movement, because of the imperatives that the pandemic seems to have imposed on our societies? Is there buy-in by society?
There is definitely a buy-in by society because it has immediate effects on society. It tells you that, you know, when your movement is restricted, then you are able to contribute to the health of society. But then if you look at it at the long run, in the long term, it does affect other rights, your freedom of movement, especially those who cannot abide by the rules of this securitization of COVID-19. So it is really, really dangerous. And I think if this is not being, if there won't be a paradigm shift to a health-centered or a rights-based way of dealing with things, then then the people will suffer in the long run.
Right. Well, you know, Joel, we just spoke to Yuyun Ningrum from AICHR just a few minutes ago, and she pointed out that human rights does not appear in the declaration from the meeting today. Does that concern you?
Definitely, and that's something that's very apparent in the declaration, in the outcome document a while ago. And I think also one thing is the mention of civil society that has been doing so much work in terms of helping out the people, in terms of disseminating information. That is also very much lacking in the outcome document.
Joel, to that particular issue, the question of media freedoms around the region, the media both used as a tool to disseminate propaganda, as it were, but also necessary in order to keep the credibility of data and so on. What are you seeing on a regional level?
Well, this information is very much apparent in these days. I mean, definitely in social media, you have people who consume information that's unverified. I've been receiving so much of that during these past days, but I still believe that, you know, that media has to be, number one, accountable with the information that they're sending out. At the same time, they need to also be vigilant in the way that they are reporting the news, because information is very much important at this point.
But unfortunately, in authoritarian regimes, there's limited transparency, and not questioning data is something that is expected and also practiced. Is that what you've also noticed?
Very much. The information that we are seeing at the moment is, a lot of us are skeptical about it. Perhaps some governments, some states would like to open their borders immediately so that they provide information that are quite attractive to the public. So it's something that we are very much skeptical about, but I think we need to really be, we need to make sure that the people who hold this information and disseminate this information are made accountable all the time.
Well, Joel, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, with me Sharaad Kuttan, signing off for this evening. Thank you so much for watching, folks, and good night.